evolutionary plans of the divine hierarchy. Now, I think that before we go into whatever it is you may have suspected you're going to hear about, we ought to first explain what the Western occult mystery school of training means by divine hierarchy, so that we do not get confused in this, and also so that we do not fall into the traps that so many people do fall into, who are, in other ways, quite sincere aspirants. That is, they fall into the trap of erroneous idolatry, actually. As a matter of fact, if you recall the very first commandment, if we feel seriously about the commandments, says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me," involving the idea of not worshiping any false images, which comes immediately after that. Now, we have, of course, noticed that in occultism, especially those who have become conditioned with certain forms, not certain forms, a very specific form of Eastern occultism, have gotten into the habit of, you might say, worshiping that which is considered the masters of wisdom. And then again, in Orthodox Christianity, the development that came, which involved worship of a personality, the personality we may call Jesus of Nazareth, who represented, without question, but we ought to keep in mind there's been more than one representation. We may love and revere individuals because they do express divinity far more than we can. At the same time, when we go in for actual worship of the representation of certain expressions of the divinity, we are falling into traps. That is, we are worshiping false images, very basically and definitely, and as long as we need to, we are going to. Think of how many people worship movie stars. God knows why. They're about the most miserable people on the face of the earth. Still, they worship them. And many people long to be in such an exalted position, that of being adored and admired and desired. But look what I think one of the most adored and desired movie stars did: committed suicide. Sadly, I adored her myself, incidentally, but not in or through idolatry, because she was such, that's Marilyn Monroe, you know, because she was such a fascinating feminine expression of a special type. And I always adore expressions that have a certain kind of perfection for whatever the expression is. And this made her a very delightful sort of a being to look at. Just to sit and look at her picture was just as beautiful as looking at a sunrise and sunset. And to look at the picture of anything that is lovely is like that. There's a part of divinity in everything. And some expressions seem to inspire it in us more readily than others. This we certainly must grant. Nevertheless, here is where we can make the terrible mistake of worshiping the false images. And one of the greatest tragedies that I feel has come to the Western evolution in the last little less than 2,000 years has been the fact that there's been a complete misunderstanding of the very wonderful, glorious, and beautiful mystical statement read this morning by our Reverend Harriet B. Case, because that really told us a mystical story, more true than words that have ever been spoken. And yet it has been misinterpreted, it has been misused, and even in modern occultism, as I said, there are certain schools of thought that engender the same kind of response, that is, misinterpretation of the real spirit and meaning behind the words. So that, as we said, some people worship the masters of wisdom as though the masters of wisdom are God. Just like some people have come to worship Jesus of Nazareth and even allude to him as our Lord Jesus. Now, I ask you to consider what could be our Lord except the divinity that definitely not only has created us, but lives us. Wouldn't you all agree, no matter what your conditioning has been, the fact that you are in a temple of the Western mysteries, to listen, indicates to me that you are certainly ready to listen or hear and understand this idea. And therefore, the idea of worshiping the idol or the false image has always been productive, incidentally, always, of what we can well call evil. The evil that keeps evolution from progressing, the polarity that is part of the thing we must overcome. Because remember, all growth takes place through the polarity. And therefore, whatever it is we think evil happens to be at any moment eventually serves good in God, whether it's recognized or not, because everything serves good and or God or the divine creator, eventually. Nevertheless, we do have cycles or periods where the pull is very much in the opposite direction, and always where the human consciousness loses the spirit of the idea of worship in the letter, takes symbolic meanings and makes them literal to itself, takes the most glorious thought or realization that was given in the words of Jesus that said, I am the Son of God, but remember also I am the Son of Man, and then makes of this an idolatrous situation where unless you believe in a particular personality, you're not going to get to whatever it is you're supposed to get to, whatever their idea is of heaven. Although I think most of us in occultism aren't very much in favor of the orthodox ideas of heaven. We'd be bored to death, you know. We'd be so bored that we'd wish we'd been greater sinners so we could get into more exciting places, I do believe. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the spirit of adventure that drives us into research, into the ideas that deal with reality. We would be satisfied with orthodox nonsense and literal interpretations. And yet the glorious statement, I am the Son of God, is true, as even the statement itself indicated, of every one of us. And the statement, I am the Son of Man, is true of every one of us. This is what is the beauty of it, that it takes a human consciousness to reach an evolutionary level where it can know, not guess, not think, not accept somebody else's word, but know, I am begotten of the Most High. I am a child of God. Now, the divine hierarchy has to do with exactly this idea. Let's consider, we will seem to diverge into another area of thought, but we won't, because we'll show you how it comes together. Let's consider the different types of form in and through which livingness expresses itself, grows itself, knows itself, lives itself. Let's think of the single cell. Now, there are single cells that are just plain single by themselves, the protozoa and types of that kind, one-celled creatures that are so tiny you cannot even remotely know they're around unless you use a microscope. And they continue to live by dividing themselves into two, just like, incidentally, the procreative condition that occurs in a different way in a more complex form when the first impregnation of a cell divides itself into two, then into two. Only here they don't stop by the two, going their separate ways till they divide into two again. In the more highly evolved form, what you have is a condition where the divisions stay together to cooperate. So the idea of seeing the advantage of cooperative endeavor seems to be an absolute essential, not seems to be, it is, even where it comes to single cells that will bring about the evolution of forms which are able to express a unity of cell intention, which brings about a capacity to express or know a more complex kind of consciousness. At least so it would seem when we look at it from the outside. So we see forms like the single cell. Then we go on from a single cell and we see some forms that have decided to cooperate. And what made them cooperate? We don't know when we look at the outside. Those who have experiences of the inner realities and of the real causative factors in life see that the center of consciousness, the evolving center of consciousness, which is always a part of God or a child of God, even in a single cell, remember, in anything, this center of consciousness has reached a point in its evolution where it can handle or control enough forces to be able to direct and control more than one cell that divides itself. And so the degree of evolution of the center of consciousness determines what kind of form it can grow in and through which to express certain powers. So that when we look at the physical forms, or the evolution of physical forms, we see a continuous graduation of the most simple, and the most simple is so complex, incidentally, the one cell, that even our modern scientists will grant, when they use mathematics and statistical analysis on it, that you cannot have had one cell remotely come about by chance. And if it isn't by chance, you know, it must be then by intention, mustn't it? And if it's intention, it means there's been a will, or a plan, or an evolutionary plan that is behind it, that is a consciousness that holds and pushes and plans. And this means deliberate growth for deliberate purposes. This is will, and this is really evolution, basically. So we have that situation where we look out into the world of form and we see that the complexity of form determines the kind of consciousness, both in the plant worlds, in the insect worlds, and then on into the other forms. And they're not really different worlds, and yet in a way they are, because their consciousness has a different level of expression or development, a different level of awareness, a different capacity. It can hold together just so much of the cosmic mind stuff to express itself in special form, which becomes that particular species, and then the individuals within the species. So if you will consider the idea that here we have this simple kind of consciousness in a single cell, then we have this growing type of complex consciousness as the forms are more complex. Of course, in Western mystery training, we reverse the ideas of the materialistic scientists and always have. We say that the reason you have a complex form is because a more highly evolved consciousness in the hierarchy is ensouling and growing and holding this form. In fact, has really grown this form by its own concentration of consciousness, which is something we cannot see physically. It's a non-physical reality. But we know it because we all know we have a consciousness, even though we don't realize that the very knowing is something non-physical, even though it takes the physical to see what level or area we're in while we're incarnated. So we have these grades of evolution which show themselves up to us in the physical forms until, for instance, we come to grades of evolution that deal with such an extraordinary type of consciousness as, for instance, a tree. Now, a tree is an evolution from an original one cell, just as we are, and from a cell that learned how to cooperate, so it became a blade of grass. And then that blade of grass, when things got real lush through the conditions of the evolution of hierarchy, making its plans, when these expressions became very lush indeed, they had to struggle for survival, and as they pushed up to get to the sun, you see, they were forced to develop stronger and stronger root systems. Can't you see this? Always the push of evolution, so that a tree is the most highly evolved form in the plant kingdom. And yet a blade of grass and a tree could be said to be about as related, basically, in one line of evolution as, for example, a complete cosmic consciousness, Christ awareness, is related to the most primitive kind of human consciousness, because it's the same species. That's the point. We are the same species. We are the most highly, that's why you often hear it said that the human consciousness is the most highly evolved species on this planet. And yet, the thing is, human beings can be in different grades of their own evolution, just like a blade of grass and a tree are almost like two ends of the pole of a certain species of evolution, though most people do not recognize this. And yet this is the way it has occurred. Those who have seen it from the inside see it like an unfolding flower. Have you ever watched the opening of a flower on special cameras that were made to sort of take in something that we see so slowly that we don't see it happening when we look at it with our ordinary eyes? That is the first growing of the plant and the bud and the opening of the bud into a flower. Have you seen cameras that have been fixed in one position and just taken regular pictures and then run the pictures together? Have you noticed the motion and flow and dance and continuity of a motion or a rhythm? How many of you, I wonder, have not seen that picture because it's been shown in the movies, it's been shown on TV, and it gives the most fantastic realization when you watch it. And that is that depending on how your consciousness is looking at the time scheme, that's how much livingness you are able to apply to any particular creature. And seeing it in the plant world, in the flowering of a bud, shows it in the most extraordinary manner. Well, this, incidentally, happens to be true of you, just as much as the plant, which, when you show it in a series of stills, those of you who are older may remember before movies became as well developed as it is now, they used to just take little pictures with slight different changes in motion. Then they'd run them together real rapidly and give the illusion of motion to what had been taken as what they called still pictures. Only those of you who are older will remember that, unless you've gone to some of the movies that show the older forms. And I recommend it to everyone, because it shows something that we very rarely realize, and that is that there can be a consciousness that might see the motion going on at a different rate from what it seems to be by those who are participating in it, like, for example, ourselves. So that we might take pictures of the embryo that's going to be a human baby, for example, and then after birth grow into an adult. We could take pictures of that and show it in one whole motion. It would look utterly different. Then suppose you had the kind of consciousness that has extended itself to more complexity yet, and could take pictures not only of the impregnation of the seed, but of the development in the mother's womb up to and including time of birth, then the actual birth, then the actual growing through infancy and childhood into adulthood. Not only that, but to old age, and then death, at least death of the form, and then rebirth in a next incarnation. what kind of image do you think you might see? And would that be less real an image? If you just took all that whole line of everything that you are, for example, if you agree that there was a time that the consciousness that is now your consciousness is an individualized human consciousness, child of God, at one time was going through learning how to control first single cells, then groups of cells into all the various forms that are the line of evolution of form. What would you look like if you took this instead of in that split still picture? If you were able to take all those pictures and bring them together in a condensed single motion camera, do you realize what a different form or shape you would seem to have than you seem to have now? And incidentally, this is what is meant by man being the image and likeness of God. And those who foolishly say man is anthropomorphic and tries to make out God in his own image and likeness as a physical being don't remotely understand what the real mystery training is about. Because man's image is not what he is in one incarnation, nor is man's image what he is at any particular stage of an incarnation. Man's image is a whole line of flowering of development from the beginning of the condensation of the adventure of becoming a self-conscious center of God instead of an unconscious center, to its fruition in one cycle of saying, I am the son and or daughter of the Most High, and I am the way, the truth, and the life. Because the moment we share a level of our self-awareness and the evolution that's involved, from that moment we become a force that is that much greater than we were before. For example, how much more power have you got than apes and chimpanzees and gorillas? How much more power do they have than lower forms? All mammal forms have more power than forms below them. And you just go up the scale. Power is a matter of evolutionary level. Evolutionary level is a matter of evolutionary age. Evolutionary age is a matter of just how much incarnational, and incidentally more than that, because when we say incarnational, we're thinking of what in Eastern occultism we call manvantaras, or even pralayas, the inbreathing and outbreathing of an incarnational situation on a total universal scale within which the smaller parts achieve their whole. So that every single one of us are parts of an evolution, what with our consciousness at present we can think of as past, though a time will come when we'll see past, present, and future in one motion, like I pointed out, we can see the unfolding of a bud into a flower in one motion, even though our consciousness doesn't see it that way because of its being limited in its concentration in time and space at this moment for this kind of growth. And in the same way, when we achieve the ability to expand our awareness, remember, the ability to expand our awareness is involved with the ability to contract it. It's because we can contract our awareness where we can see, and that is our time sense, where we can watch a flower or a plant bloom. We put a seed in the ground, and we have to wait what to our consciousness is a certain length of time before the first green sprout comes up. Then we have to watch that getting bigger and bigger, and then becoming whatever it's going to become in terms of a plant or a bush, and then in terms of its bud, and its flower, and then its seed. We have to put that into a quite extended time area from our point of view, as we pointed out. And yet, to the consciousness of the plant that's unfolding, it might be infinitely longer or infinitely shorter. And our higher self sees. Now we're going to be able to go into the main idea of the topic now that I've shown you these analogies. Our higher self sees the incarnational period after period, not only as human incarnations, but as the seed before it was able to make the form human. Sees it all as one sweeping motion like a dance. Sees the end as clearly as the beginning. Just like an architect sits down with a piece of paper and draws the plan of the whole house with every detail, and sees the end from the beginning, because this is the plan of evolution that has been set out by that center of God, which is each one of us, and each one of every living thing, not just us. We are all units within one livingness, and that's God, remember. That's part of the glory or blessing of our eternalness. That's what makes us eternal. Whatever forms come up or down are meaningless in terms of this continuous motion of the consciousness that does it. And so now in the hierarchy, now we can have a better understanding of the idea of hierarchy. The idea of the divine hierarchy is really the same as what we've been pointing out in terms of the form. Just like you have the one-celled and the group of cells, and then the different levels and layers of living creatures, from the simple plant to the complex plant, from the so-called simple cell to the complex group of cells, through the various kingdoms of the cold-blooded and the warm-blooded into the mammals, and on into human consciousness. This is all a graded evolution of hierarchical ability for the consciousness to be aware of itself in a larger measure than it would have been otherwise. And notice how you're aware of yourself in a larger measure to the degree that you can condense yourselves and the force or substance of God into more and more concentration. Because realize this, that your body is a condensation or a concentration of cosmic mind stuff, which works in special ways. That's what your body is. And the condensation is the very same thing as when you concentrate on a book or a story, or a TV show, or a movie, or a love affair, or a hate affair, or a fear, or a hope. Your consciousness concentrates, and the very concentration gives you an extra intensity of awareness, just like the concentration of light through the piece of glass will start a fire. The more intense the consciousness, the more highly evolved it is. And the more intense it is, the more highly evolved it is, the deeper it goes, the wider is its sphere of influence or power, just automatically. And the whole hierarchy of consciousness is involved in this. So when we speak about the divine hierarchy, it might be a good idea, instead of looking up and worshiping masters of wisdom, and they're there, they certainly should have all of our reverence. Instead of doing that, we should start worshiping and revering the divinity that is expressing in all the forms below, as well as above, that which we are at present. It is the divinity in and through these forms, which is the real meaning of hierarchy. And just as we are, you might say, at the moment, the flower, and we're still flowering, you see. That's why we're such you-know-whats most of the time, under some conditions, and then we are saints other times, under other conditions, not as often those we would like. Sometimes we have the wrong idea of what being a saint should be. Nevertheless, we are merely in a stage, an embryonic stage, of waking up to our own divinity. But there are others, and they are on the same line. In other words, they're the same species. If you want to know the truth, even the little worm in the ground, the little one-celled creature, is the same species as us, the same species as God or Master Wisdom. Again, it's a different evolutionary level on the hierarchy of that particular point of consciousness or divinity. So when we see it this way, we certainly would be very foolish, wouldn't we, to take any particular personality, no matter how much divinity it has learned to express, and say, this is our Lord, as we pointed out. We worship our Lord every time we look into the eyes of each other, if we're loving each other, by the way. And we're worshiping our Lord every time we have an ecstasy that relates to any plant or any scene, any star, any sound of any creature. Every emotion of love is really the worshiping of our Lord, because there isn't anything that's living that isn't part of divinity. And just as vital and important a part of divinity as any other part. In other words, would you say that a 2 or 3 day infant is less important than a 90-year-old man? Ask yourself that question. Think of it for a moment. Is a 2 or 3 day old infant less important at the age of 2 and 3 than that same center of consciousness at age 90? Let's put it that way. All right. Then what makes us think that those who are less evolved than us, and that includes every living creature that exists, what makes us think these beings and these creatures and these centers of consciousness are less important than us? In the same way, what makes us think that those that are beyond us are more important than us or them? We have a master wisdom behind our work, of course, if our work is a true work. The divine hierarchy really rests on these very simple basis, that which is evolved a higher level of consciousness is automatically a higher power with a higher understanding and a higher perception. And because of the higher understanding, higher perception, higher power, it automatically has responsibilities. Now, you know yourselves, the older you got, the more responsibilities you got. Most of us don't like it. I'd like to get rid of quite a few, but God won't let me. Or any one of us. Inasmuch as God is all there is. God says, in essence, like something like, I should waste all this time I've been spending in developing this center and not be utilizing it to the full. Why, what do they think? I'm crazy? Well, some people have thought God must be crazy to create, but a chuckle is good in our aspiration. Remember, if we can't chuckle with God and life and aspiration, we can't remotely see into the heart of livingness, and we'd be taking our personality so seriously. We'll be like the woman who wrote to us after our last additive news notes, where our adorable Helen decided to give a good humorous slant to the whole report on the New Zealand report. I mean, it was all very literal, incidentally, and, so there was all this chuckle about what was taking place. The laughter was put in. And one woman wrote a letter, and the whole letter was utter indignation. It was just read to me day before yesterday by Reverend Harry B. Case. She wrote in, how many of you have not read the New Zealand report of the additive news notes? Would you raise your hands? Open high, so I can't tell when you so gently and secretly hold them down like that. Well, if you have your copies, go home and read it, and you'll understand better what I was talking about. If you haven't got your copies, pick one up over here. The report of my New Zealand trip was given in the form of letters and little editor's notes of reactions. And because it was decided to make it humorous, since, people get tired of everything being so serious. I know if anyone had tried to tell me that the spiritual path was super serious, I'd have run like blazes. Because anyone who can think clearly knows that when you take your personality too seriously, you're not remotely capable of transmuting it. You've got to see it in a proper perspective, which is part of the hierarchical kind of thinking, really, the higher level thinking. So we had this letter from the woman who said, what do you mean you were all worried, ominous indication? You see, our greatly honored Frater Alistair, having a very fine sense of humor, wrote to headquarters while I was in New Zealand and said, he said, greatly honored Sir Anne has arrived. Don't worry about her. We'll take good care of her. And the woman said, now why, if he knows the truth, that's with a capital T. You know, truth students always know the truth with a capital T. And I think it's marvelous. I think the masters of wisdom ought to sit at their feet. They know the truth so well. And knowing the truth with a capital T, you see, now why, she asked, should he have said don't worry? Anyone who follows truth, knows that you don't worry. So he said, don't worry, we'll take care of her. Then he said, at the arrival, he said, she arrived, she took New Zealand, one-woman invasion, very successful. She's taken us by storm. We like it so well. We've torn up her plane ticket. We've decided to keep her. And then our Helen, that's Reverend Helen Miller, put in a little editor's note saying, very ominous sign, they're trying to steal our Prolocutor General. We are very worried, or something like that, you see. And the woman in the letter, the same woman, wrote, now why should you be worried? Don't you trust God? Don't you think everybody should be where they're supposed to be? This is true. The letter is thus not correct. I mean, this is literally correct. Our temple, we had hysteria here at the temple over this particular letter. It's like the people, and I've known a few, haven't you, who are shown a New Yorker cartoon, and they don't get the point, and you have to sit down and explain the point to them. Haven't you known people like that? You have to explain to them just what it is about it that's funny. You know, Lord, deliver us. And so we had, now, you see, those who really have achieved even the slightest degree of inner perception know that the whole creation is really a joyous chuckle of life, even though we have the sorrows we do, and we grant it. We're not turning our back on this idea. Nevertheless, as has often been pointed out, have you ever enjoyed any movie or play if you didn't have a problem that had to be worked out? Unless there was a villain that was going to get the wonderful hero into trouble and heroine into trouble, wouldn't you get bored to tears? Would you even remotely be interested in that particular story or play or movie? Would you now? So of course we have to have these problems to overcome, and the very result of overcoming sharpens our attention, you know. And it gives a different idea that relates to the reason for problems. And when we start seeing it in this new way, this chuckle, it gives us this higher perception. Well, the point to keep in mind then is that in the hierarchy of consciousness, as we have been pointing out, the ability to see the difference between that which is growing continuous flowers to express itself in and through, that real I, is, after all, the eternal I that is able to enjoy this whole process. And in fact, it's the responsibility of every one of us to learn how to enjoy it if we haven't learned how to do it yet. And to even learn how to see our down cycles as part of the thing that gives us the drive to become more and more and more. Spirituality is not supposed to be, it isn't supposed to be a sort of tearful, martyr-provoking, tear-jerking, you might almost say suicidal urge type of development at all. Oh, the world is so horrible, so horrible, so horrible. It is pain. This is the Buddhist point of view, and I always shared it very completely, you know, in my youth. But one of the things, we must outgrow our youth, you know. We really must. And we must see it from a larger point of view. Then when we see it, we get to seeing the charm, even the humor, in the things that we've taken so seriously. Now then, as I pointed out, those who want to worship and you know, sort of look with awe upon a master and say, now tell me, you know how many of us, we want to give up our problems. Somebody else take care of them would be wonderful. I've tried and tried to find a way. Nobody lets me. Because as I said, God apparently, any time God's worked so hard with every one of us to reach a certain evolutionary level, that God, which is the higher self of us, sees to it that the responsibilities that are part of an age level are performed. And so we perform them automatically. When we don't, it's just because we haven't achieved the age level where we're able to, really. People who escape from reality, people who have no sense of responsibility, are really younger souls. And of course, we have to teach them a sense of responsibility in whatever way we can, but we can't expect them to have the same sense of responsibility that a more highly evolved soul has. The whole hierarchy, then, the divine hierarchy, is based on the evolutionary level. And the evolutionary level automatically gives a sense of responsibility. And it automatically extends it to larger areas. So that, for example, the more immature type of soul that has developed a certain maturity, after all, might have a sense of responsibility for its family. And this is good. Imagine what would happen to a family if it didn't. But of course, you know, it shares this with every cat and dog and wild creature. And it's a beautiful expression of the divine responsibility towards its own survival, which it is, inevitably. But then, as souls evolve, the responsibility enlarges because the realization of what family is enlarges. So that I may feel a sense of responsibility when I am an immature soul for just what an immature soul can, just for instance, the immediate family. Then the more evolved I become, the more it stretches itself out. Finally, we feel a sense of responsibility not only for our mates and offspring, but also a sense of gratitude and love for the parents, and the a feeling of belongingness towards the sisters and brothers. Then it extends itself out into a sort of tribe where we'll stick by each other. But boy, any other tribe sure going to get our club and serve us. We're going to just kill them right and left because they're going to be a menace to our survival. And we're being more highly evolved, though, than if we fought only for our immediate offspring, wouldn't we? Here now we're proud of ourselves as a tribe. And of course, one of the troubles with civilization today is that we're still too tribal-minded. You know how nations, every nation, goes off into hysteria, and we have killings and lusts because this flag isn't put up or that one. Isn't that just the tribal worship still? And of course, one of the troubles with civilization today is that we're still too tribal-minded. You know how nations, every nation, goes off into hysteria, and we have killings and lusts because this flag isn't put up or that one. Isn't that just the tribal worship still? It's still not the higher level of consciousness at all. When you have to be screeching about your flag, you see, you've made a thing a false worshiping idol. You see what I mean? You've taken a symbol and you've gotten lost in a letter instead of using that symbol to inspire you to a realization of the livingness and unity of beings involved and being able to stretch it out. So as Dr. Case and I used to often discuss, along with our precious Reverend Harry B. Case, and as the Master has often said, the measure of the evolutionary age of any being is its measure of feeling of social fraternity. Therefore, when your family becomes enlarged so that it includes not just your tribe, your nation, or, these states' writers, you know how they fight for states' right and everything else is evil? Well, from their evolutionary level, that may be right. But what about those people who've achieved a state of consciousness where the whole nation is their child and sister and brother? What about those who've reached the stage of evolution where the whole planet is their sister and brother? And they're called dirty names, as though the most evil thing on earth is because they have world consciousness. They say, why? Well, they're one-worlders. Haven't you heard that used as a dirty name by the ultra? You know what's? Haven't you? And as though they're preaching a high spiritual thing, it's just as though they're saying why he committed adultery and incest. One would be bad enough, but both. That really, and even then, that idea of one worlder. What's wrong with peace and one world and brotherhood of man? Do you see? This is the difference in the hierarchical levels. Your most highly evolved type have a social conscience. The degree of social conscience is really the indication of your level in the hierarchy. That ought to give you a lot of thinking. And then you better find out what social conscience means also. And the masters of wisdom have achieved this long since. They therefore have the responsibility that you would have for your child, your infant, or parent. They have the same feeling towards humanity. And those of us who have achieved these various levels, to us it is utterly bewildering to think that anyone couldn't immediately recognize that not only is all humanity one family, but every living creature is one family. Then it extends even beyond the social conscience for humanity. It includes all living things that should be cherished and loved and helped. We don't go out then hunting for recreation. If we must kill to survive, at least there's a little sorrow in our hearts that it is being done that way at this time. And now, therefore, the evolutionary plan really has to do with a capacity to tune in to the proper levels for the next stage. The masters of wisdom do not know what the stage 7 or 8 will be, or even perhaps 5 or 6. They do know, because they are more highly evolved than average, even highly evolved humanity, what the Aquarian age involves as the brotherhood of man. And they therefore are working, and this is what is so simple and yet so rarely understood. They are working to bring about a greater social conscience, a greater awareness in each and every one of us that we are part of each other, and we must therefore try to learn about this, work with it, develop our sense of I in such a way, work with our techniques, so that we'll stop being so overwhelmed with nonsense, so that we'll stop being the foolish kind who's sitting in the audience and watching a play where the villain is threatening the hero. The one in the audience will take the gun and go bang, bang, in order to protect the hero from that villain and actually kill an actor who's just trying to give them a little pleasure and enjoyment. This is what we do when we get lost in the letter, when we worship false idols. And so, as I pointed out, the whole plan of the divine hierarchy is really an ability to tune into each higher level of the divine will. Those of us who reach a certain freedom from the smaller areas because of having developed an ability to hold a greater amount of consciousness in our cup of individuality, see the larger pictures. And when we do, we don't get caught up as often in the personality tragedies. We see them as just the washing tides. We overcome them much more rapidly. Where we might have been in agony or pain for several incarnations, we can cut it down first to 1 or 2. Then we can cut it down to maybe just a few years. Then we can cut it down so some situation or problem hits us. We can become overwhelmed. We can get over it maybe in a few months, in a few weeks. Then maybe after a while, it just takes a few moments. Something will hit us. We see a larger picture, and we immediately can raise our consciousness, knowing that the divine hierarchy is with us, and we are part of it. That we are part of a plan to bring a different order of knowing and being and acting. That we're each playing our part according to the level we're on. That we are brought together here in this temple because we have reached the capacity, each and every one of us in our own way, to do something for the fuller brotherhood, for this next step. What the eventual step is, I don't think any of us need to worry about, do we? If we sat and worried about what's going to happen 7 incarnations from now, what in the devil would we be doing with this one? And how would we be preparing for the next one? The point is, we know what the divine hierarchy has in mind for the next one, because it is the divine plan that is being received by those who've achieved the radio ability in their own mechanisms to receive that awareness. And it can receive that awareness because it can feel that amount of love. And it can feel that amount of love because it has reached that capacity. And so we are always helped by those who've gone before us, just like every true parent takes care of its children until it's grown up. We are always helped by those who've gone before us, and they are helped by those who've gone before them, and so on. And it's up to us to help those who are coming up to us, if we are going to be a conscious part of the hierarchy, and we have reached an evolutionary level where we can be. In fact, this is what being human really involves. We can become, and are learning right now how to become a conscious part of this hierarchy, this plan. And that plan, without any question at all, is known to be the Aquarian Age, which means ushering in the brotherhood of man, which means that only those who have reached the evolutionary stage can participate in it as well as help to bring it in. And so we who love our children, and our children means every human being who's not as highly evolved as we are, whatever that might mean, as well as all other creatures, it is up to us then to spread our thought, our feeling, to work at our own growth, to put in our word for the higher vision, the more spiritual orientation. It is up to us to be the channels for the hierarchy, which we are being trained to be, and many of us here, sitting here today, have become more and more potent. Some of us to degrees we're not even consciously aware of yet, but will be as we work together here. And that's why we've developed so much more power as a group right here in this temple, in the Sunday services and in the classes. So you see, it's quite a little bit different type of talk than you would have expected for the plan of the divine hierarchy. I didn't give you the details, though incidentally I know about the most important ones, because the details are not important. The important thing is the overall realization that it is up to you, every one of you, to work at playing your part, holding the love, holding the realization of the miracle and wonder that you are, knowing that because you are eternal, because you are an eternal growth process in the one deity, that you are secure and safe, and working to know this so thoroughly that you are the son and daughter of God, that you can afford to do whatever is necessary to spread this realization as a wave of knowing and love to others. And it takes us away then from the concentration on personalized negative emotions that we don't need anymore. We've had them. And if we do need them, we don't need them that long. We can throw them off more rapidly, can't we, honey? And come out with a more intense ecstasy. Because remember, the hierarchy intends for every one of us to know the ecstasy of love to degrees beyond the remotest comprehension at the moment. And this is your destiny. But you've reached the point where you've got to help bring it for yourselves, for you, for each other, and for those who are coming up after you. And I think that's a glorious thing to know, don't you? Let's work at it.